On to module 3, which I was already trying to jump into with terms like cephalodia and photobiont, but now we're going to dive really deep into lichen terms and traits. And the reason for this is if you are interested in lichens, particularly if you want to go out and identify them, inevitably you will use something like a guide or a key, and they are just loaded with these traits. Biologists love coming up with their own lists of vocabulary for whatever particular organism they are studying. This is just a fact. Often this is very useful, but it means it can be a bit of a learning curve to jump into a new group. So I'll try to walk you through some of the basics here. So let's begin. The most important term to start with is the thallus. This means the body of the lichen, or rather you can think of it as a lichen individual is a lichen thallus. And I have, of course, Ernst Haeckel's beautiful illustrations of many lichen thalli here as an example. So lichens come in a ton of beautiful forms, which again, even someone like Ernst Haeckel, who was illustrating beautiful forms across the tree of life, could not avoid because they are just so fantastic. And so, yes, each of these sort of individuals or each of these individual structures would be referred to as a lichen thallus. It's the body of the lichen. What about those different forms? So we refer to these as lichen morphologies or lichen growth forms. And there are 3 main kinds that we discuss, but then I'll go into a few sort of additional categories of growth forms that we've come up with. Like I said, the further you dive in, the more nuanced it will become, but this is a broad intro. So starting with the crustose growth form, which is considered the most basic growth form in terms of the different layers that are involved. So this is crustose, crust-like. These are generally very tightly pressed against or even partially embedded within their substrate. And just quickly, because I'm throwing a lot of terms into here, substrate is simply whatever the lichen is growing on. So this could be the bark of a tree or a rock or soil. Any of those things would be considered the substrate. So crusts grow very close to the substrate, sometimes even partially embedded within it. And they are a very common and hardy growth form of lichens, but commonly overlooked. And even once people learn about them, including lichenologists, they are also commonly avoided because they can be very difficult to identify. They can be very cryptic, but also often to identify a crust lichen, you need a microscope to look at a lot of microscopic features. It's not universally true. There are some that are very distinctive, but this is generally the case. And so often, especially with sort of in-person lichen workshops, we tend to focus on the other growth forms. This, of course, has made me love crust lichens most of all because they are the overlooked ones, and I can't help but want to give them a voice and a face. And so I'm a big fan of crust lichens and would argue that they are really important to look at in terms of a lot of ecological questions, conservation questions, etc. So in terms of their actual structure, this diagram in the middle of the slide that you're looking at is a drawing of a cross section. So it's just like that sandwich slice of bread that I showed you in one of the previous modules. So if we slice straight down through a lichen and look at it under a microscope, this is what we'll see. So when I was talking about those hyphal structures in the Q&A or the different tissue types, this upper cortex, it has these really much fatter, thicker hyphae that form this dense tissue layer, again, called the cortex. For crusts, they only have an upper cortex. And then right below that is the algal layer. Obviously, it needs to be close to the top because it needs to get enough light for photosynthesis. But the cortex is a very important protective layer because it helps to filter out some of the really, really intensely harmful UVB and other kinds of rays, and just helps to filter through the optimal light for photosynthesis. And of course, it forms other protections as well, protection from desiccation, for example, or drying out. Below the algal layer is the medulla or medullary layer. This is where we have the much looser and often thinner hyphal structures. And this is a place for gas exchange, but also water holding. So lichens are really cool. And I didn't mention this at all yet, but they can dry out completely and then rehydrate relatively quickly and become metabolically active relatively quickly after hydration. This is a trait known as poikilohydry, which is a very big word, but yeah, so they can survive total desiccation. And they're not dead, they're just dried out. They're just waiting for the next moisture arrival. And they can gain that moisture from, rain and other forms of precipitation, but also from just relative humidity and fog. And so that is a really cool feature of lichen biology and physiology as well. So again, the crust basically has these 3 layers. And here are some examples of some beautiful photographs not taken by me of crust lichens. So here's one. These images, the images in this section were all taken by Robert Looking and Matt Nelson. These are lichenologists whom I met at the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, but Robert Looking is now currently at the Berlin Botanic Garden and Museum in Germany. So one thing to point out here, especially when you're starting to try to identify crusts or key them out, is you can see that the surface of this one is quite granular. And so that's a question that might come up: is the surface smooth or granular? And so that's a feature to look out for. Also, the color, of course, the color of these apothecia, which I'll get to in a few slides, is very distinct. They're bright red. That's very rare in lichens, but is very exciting. And of course, a very important feature to look for. Here's another crust. And so again, in terms of that, in terms of keying it out, this one might be described as cracked, or it might be described as areolate. And areolate just means composed of multiple areoles, which are these little, basically each yellow blob would kind of be considered its own areole. So those are some additional features of the crusts, or crustose lichens. The next growth form is foliose. So this means leaf-like. These are more 3-dimensional than the crusts. Sometimes they can still be flat against the substrate, or raised just above it, or raised quite a bit above it. And they are comprised of lobes. So if you can see my cursor, each of these sort of individual pieces forking off would be considered a lobe. And an important thing about the foliose, because they can sometimes be confused with the other 3-dimensional structure that we'll get to, foliose lichens have a distinct top side and lower surface. So that's a really important feature, especially when you're going to a key and you're like, I just can't find this thing. It might be, a foliose posing as another kind, a more 3-dimensional growth form. So when we sandwich slice through this one, we have this upper cortex again of these really thickened cells, the algal layer, the medullary layer, and then very importantly, we now have a lower cortex. So again, that enables them to lift off the substrate, but still be protected underneath because they have this lower cortex layer. Some of them, not all of them, also have these rhizines. So those are little root-like structures. They're not actually roots, or rather, they're not functioning in the same way as roots do of a plant. They are holdfasts. They're holding on to the substrate. You can think of them as little roots, or you could think of them as little feet that are holding on, but also even lifting this lichen off, which enables it to have a sort of different interaction with its environment than something like a crust that's totally oppressed to the substrate. So some examples of some foliose lichens are, again, beautiful photos taken by Robert and Matt. And what's cool about this one is that grayish one that you see underneath and this super bright big green one in the foreground, it's the same lichenized fungus, but one, the gray one, is associating with cyanobacteria, and the top one is associating with green algae. So that was an instance that I didn't discuss in that three-way relationship. You can also, some lichens, definitely not all, some can alternate between the two. Yeah, really want to caveat. Some lichens only associate with cyanobacteria or only associate with green algae. Some associate with green algae and cyanobacteria at the same time, and then a very small number of them can flip-flop, depending on what photobionts they encounter in their environment. So really cool. This is another example of a foliose, but as you can see, this one's a bit flatter oppressed. So you might take a moment to be like, is this a foliose or is this a crustose? But you can see it's divided into those lobes. And then I included this one because it has this other cool feature that, again, you might encounter in a key or a guide. This sort of black fuzzy blanket that it's on is what's called the hypothallus. So the thallus beneath the thallus. It's all part of the same structure. The exact role of that, we're not quite sure. Again, only some lichens have this hypothallus, and it may, help with water retention and things like that. But again, it's a distinctive feature to look for the presence or absence of when keying it out. So our other super three-dimensional growth form are the Fruticose lichens. These can be thought of as bushy, so very three-dimensional, upright, or pendulose, very three-dimensional, hanging down. And right, three-dimensional, often with long branches, but not always. They can be kind of like small little bushy tufts. And what distinguishes these Fruticose from, say, a very three-dimensional Foliose is that there's no difference between the upper and lower surfaces, or the upper cortex and the lower cortex if you take a cross section. So that is really helpful, again, when you're trying to look this up or key it out, because often keys and even guides will be divided into Crustose, Foliose, and Fruticose. So it's helpful to know the differences between those. So yeah, so again, the structure of this looks relatively similar to a foliose, where you have your upper cortex, algal layer, medullary layer, but then because it's sort of the same on all sides. There can be some exceptions because lichens are lichens. There's always some exception to the rule, but generally they're the same on all sides. So if you do a sandwich slice, you'll then actually encounter another algal layer and then what we call the lower cortex, but it's just lower relative to the other cortex of the slice. So again, that's a useful way to be like, is this foliose or is this fruticose? If I take a slice through it, how many algal layers am I seeing? And again, of course, there's nuance and exception, but that's sort of the general idea of the structure there. Some examples. So this is, oh, I don't know if I mentioned it on the previous slide, so I will mention it now. So foliose lichens are divided into lobes. Fruticose lichens are divided into branches. So that's how we refer to these structures here. But lichens come in a lot of different shapes and forms, even within these three major growth forms. So this is also an example of a fruticose lichen. This is a lichen, yes. It's all these crazy little like pointy fingers coming right out of the ground, or growing right on the ground. Again, they don't have roots like plants. This is Thamnolia vermicularis. For those of you who read through that California lichens document that I sent out, it's mentioned in there actually as being threatened in the state of California, even though in some other states it's doing quite well. I have personally encountered this lichen and fell in love with it in the alpine tundra in Colorado. So it can be found in alpine environments. It's very distinctive and very fun. So hopefully many of you will get the chance to meet this lichen someday. But also just a wild example of what we would refer to as a fruticose lichen. So like I said, there are other growth forms as well. There's something we call leprose. Now, if you have a guide that's only divided into those 3 main growth forms, leprose will fall under the crustose category. They're generally quite close to the substrate. They have less internal structuring than even a crustose lichen. They're basically just loose hyphae and algae. There can be a little bit of structuring within that. You can see some of these are forming into kind of like little granules or spheres. But again, it's not as structured as those main ones. But if you have a key or guide that only has those 3 main ones, leprose would fall within crustose. There's also filamentous. This is Cynegonium. That's a whole genus. I don't know the particular species that's pictured here. And it is another one of my favorite lichens. The common name for the genus is the pixie hair lichen, which makes sense if you look at the very sort of floofy filamentous shape of this. This particular genus is really cool because, again, it does not have that same internal structuring as those crusts, Foliose and Fruticose. And in fact, the algae in this association remains filamentous. So instead of being those little spheres, the algae is filamentous, and then the fungal hyphae just wrap around it. And that leads to this filamentous growth form, which is, again, really fascinating. And but again, if you had a guide that only had those 3 main growth forms, this would most likely fall under Fruticose because it's very 3-dimensional and bushy. Finally, there's also squamulose. So this does have that same sort of structure where if you took a cross-section through it, you would see, a cortex, the algal layer, the medullary layer, a lower cortex of some sort. And often with squamulose, the fruiting bodies are sort of sticking up above these little individual pieces of thallus or squamules. This one could fall under different categories, kind of depending on how we're approaching it, whether we're approaching it from the 3-dimensionality of it, or whether we're approaching it from like difference between upper and lower cortex. But most commonly when we are lumping squamulose into one of those bigger categories, it goes into the Fruticose. So yes, so now let's zoom in on some of the other structures. So we started with the thallus. We now know different growth forms of the thallus. What else is going on? The main thing that you'll encounter that actually you saw in most of those lichen photos that I just shared with you are fruiting bodies. So these are the reproductive structures. Usually this just refers to the reproductive structures of that main fungal partner or mycobiont. So we'll start with the sexual fruiting bodies of the mycobiont. And first we'll start with apothecia. So apothecia are these disc to cup-shaped fruiting bodies. This picture on the left here, these big discs are all apothecia on this lichen. But as you can see in this diagram on the right, they can still come in, even apothecia can come in a lot of different shapes and sizes, but we call them all apothecia. So the most classic form are these, sort of disc shapes that can become somewhat cup-shaped, a more convex sort of disc shape, and then within that, some of them can have a layer of thallus around them. So this tissue surrounding the apothecium actually has algal cells in it, whereas in this case, it just has fertile tissue and no algal cells. So that's another level of differentiation when you get to certain keys. And again, especially those crustose keys that you'll want to pay attention to. Then we get some really fun shapes. This letter D here, this is an example of a apothecium that you would see on umbilicaria. So actually that was one of the intro slides if you were here early enough to see those. Umbilicarias are these really cool lichens. They grow on rocks. They're usually brownish gray, but the one that we showed at the beginning is red. And some of them can be somewhat greenish too. And they can be quite long-lived and get quite huge. So in certain places, I've seen this in northern Michigan as a random example, they can just be like what looks like almost a giant lettuce leaf on the side of a rock. And it's umbilicaria. But if you look closely, especially if you have the most essential tool of a lichenologist, which is a hand lens, you can take a closer look at them and see these really cool fruiting body structures. This next one, E, this image right in the middle of this diagram, these are still apothecia, but they're linear. We call these laurelli, and laurelli are on a number of lichen species, but generally people might be familiar with Graphis scripta or just Graphis the genus. These are the script lichens, and it's because these laurelli actually look like some type of script or hieroglyphics or something, and that's how they got their common name, the script lichens. That's a crust lichen, but a really fun one to encounter. But it can be very small, especially out here. In the tropics, you can just see tons of script lichens, and it's wild. And some of the laurelli can be orange and red and yellow, but most of them are black. And most of the script lichens you would see out here being California, is where I'm speaking to you from. They can be rather small, and you really have to use that hand lens and stare at a twig or a branch for quite some time. And then there are some other structures here. I won't get into all of them, but it's just, again, more variance on the form of this apothecia. This last one is just like in that squamulose example that I showed you, where the apothecia are sort of raised up on these stalks. And those stalks can sometimes be called podetia. So like I said, there's a ton of terms here. If you just remember one, it's apothecia. Another version of a sexual fruiting body, of a sexual fruiting body, is perithecia. So it's just again, a different, basically, housing of the fertile tissue. Instead of in these cups, it's sort of in these embedded things, which can be completely embedded within the thallus or raised above it in these little mounds, as you can see in this pruina image over here on the left. And again, if you're interested in keying these out, there are features to look for. So not just whether they're embedded or not, but in this diagram, you notice that some parts are colored in black. That in a key will be called carbonization. And it will ask, is it just carbonized at the top? Is it fully carbonized all around? Or is it just carbonized on the sides? And so that is an important feature to look for, again, if you are able to look at a section under a microscope. This would be a compound microscope, one that you actually are mounting slides onto. So this is super microscopic features, but especially if you're getting into the crusts, these will be features that you'll have to look for to really get to the species level. So those were sexual reproductive structures. So the important thing to note there, I'll actually go back to talk about this, is these are just fertile tissue, fungal fertile tissue. So what these will send off is fungal spores, fungal sexual spores, which will then have to land somewhere and germinate and find a suitable partner to form that lichen all over again. So there's a lot of questions once people learn about lichens and this, super cool symbiosis is, oh, there's probably been either some gene exchange or some gene loss over time if two things are living that closely together for that long. But some of that might be avoided by the fact that many of these lichens have to form anew every time. So there's, advantages and disadvantages to that. That's a slight evolutionary tangent, but just sort of related to this idea of having to reform the lichen. But there are asexual propagules, and in this particular case, what I'm referring to is fragmentation. So in these asexual fruiting bodies, one example is isidia. These are, again, super small finger-like structures, and that's why I included this picture of this whole lichen here, because it can be hard to know exactly what isidia look like, especially from this sort of macroscopic view. But you can see there's a lot of texture on the edges of those lobes of that lichen, of Platysmatia glauca. And those are isidia. So if you start seeing that interesting texture along the edge, pay attention, it's probably some sort of asexual propagules. So the way isidia work, it's a finger-like protrusion of the lichen thallus itself. So you have that upper cortex, you have your algae, your photosynthetic partner already in there, and some medullary tissue, etc. Wind, rain, or even a small animal or a large animal, I've knocked plenty of isidia off myself, can knock these off. They'll fall somewhere and land, and when they start growing, it's essentially a clone of the lichen that it came from, but it already has everything it needs to get started. It's got the fungal partner, it's got the algal partner, it likely has a lot of that microbiome already ready to go. So that's a very different strategy from sending off just a fungal spore and hoping that it finds everything that it needs wherever it lands. There are multiple asexual strategies. So another one is soredia. These look more like a little powder as opposed to these little like textured projections. And what they are is they don't have that cortex. It's just a bundle of fungal hyphae and algal cells. And again, probably some components of the microbiome. And again, these can be wind or rain or animal dispersed. Sometimes they're just kind of a powder scattered throughout, but more often they are contained within these structures called soralia, which is just a bunch of soredia. But an important feature to pay attention to is where they are on the lichen. So that's what this diagram at the bottom is showing you, is are they just sort of on the surface in these little packets? Are they along the edge, or are they at the terminal ends of the lobe or the branch or what have you? So the positioning of the soralia is important. And here's an example of what that would actually look like in a lichen. So again, this is somewhat zoomed in, but basically what you would see with the naked eye, which is this is a Ramalina species, and these fuzzy pockets are the soralia. And so again, it's not taking as much with it as the isidia because it's missing that cortical layer. But again, it's got the fungal partner, the algal partner, probably a lot of the microbiome. So it's gonna be ready to get started as soon as it lands somewhere. So again, there's different strategies, and each strategy has some advantages and disadvantages. Some lichens just use one of those strategies. Sometimes some lichens actually reproduce both sexually and asexually, sort of really optimizing their different potentials. So we've gone from thallus, the body of the lichen, to the different growth forms. On those growth forms, what are the different reproductive structures? But of course, there are other structures and features on lichens that are important to pay attention to when identifying them. So particularly for foliose lichens, I mentioned some of them have rhizines. And just like everything else, rhizines can come in a diversity of forms. And there's just some examples of them pictured here. So you can have some branching forms with these sort of larger branches. You can have very simple rhizines, so no branching, nothing really going on there. You can have these rhizines that have the kind of branching that's really feathery, like a whole bunch. You can have really short rhizines, really long rhizines, really complex rhizines, or then you can actually get to this stuff that's called tomentum, which looks like the whole underside of the lichen is very fuzzy or felty. And that's just another version of this sort of raising the lichen above the substrate a little bit. And again, is that to maximize gas exchange or water holding or as a holdfast? We're still figuring all of that out. Rhizines can also be sparse, so just a few on the underside of a lichen, so few sometimes that you might follow the key in the wrong direction, like it has no rhizines, oh whoops, there's a few. Or as pictured in this Phaeophysia, very abundant, so abundant, it really is like three-dimensionally raising the lichen off the substrate because there's just so many rhizines there. So again, particularly for the foliose lichens, this is an important feature to pay attention to. Rhizines can be confused with another structure called cilia. These are hair-like structures. They're often black, sometimes white, that come off the edges, but just the edges of lichens, as opposed to the underside of lichens. So rhizines are on the underside, but again, these are so thick, they almost look like they're coming off the edges too. Cilia are just on the edges. The role of these, again, we are not entirely sure. Is it moisture capture? Is it some sort of deterrent of herbivory, maybe? Something else? We're still figuring all of that out. But again, it's a very useful distinguishing feature once you get an eye for it for identifying certain species of lichens. On this Sticta species pictured here, we're looking at the underside. So we flipped it over. There's that tomentum. So all this fuzzy brownness would be considered tomentum. But you can see there are these white patches or pores, or the actual term for them is cyphellae. So that's a unique feature of Sticta and a few other groups. Because these things just get more complex the more you dive into them, there's a genus of lichens called pseudocephalaria, meaning it has pseudocyphellae. So they look very similar to the cyphellae, especially at the macroscopic level. And you can easily confuse Sticta and pseudocyphellae. So pseudocyphalaria. So if you're keying one out and you can't find it in one group, you might want to try jumping to the other one and see if it's there. So these are just some additional lichen structures that are useful when trying to identify them. Other features, again, that will come up in keys or guides, but also just fun features to look out for as you're exploring the world of lichens. The actual color of the lichens is very useful in identification, but one really important thing to note is lichens can look very different between when they are wet and when they are dry. And lichenologists have really struggled to factor that into the keys, but for the most part, when you're keying out a lichen, the color that's being described is the color when dry, unless it specifies blah, blah, blah color when wet, because generally when you're encountering a lichen, it will be dry rather than wet. And so if you encounter a wet lichen, keep in mind that it might be a lot paler or even a totally different color when it's dry. So something very important to pay attention to. Like I mentioned, some lichens can be tomentose. They have that tomentum underneath, but some of them can actually be fuzzy on the upper side too. And so that's a feature to look out for. One really fun one that unfortunately I don't think I have a picture of in this workshop is Areoderma. It can be found in a few places, but the place I encountered it was in the cloud forests in Central America. It's very fuzzy looking, and so that gives it a very iconic look. Some other lichens, either the whole thallus or just the fruiting bodies, can be pruinose, which means powdery. The pruina themselves are sometimes crystals or sometimes other structures, but again, that can totally change what the color of the lichen looks like. And there's some cool examples, although I'm completely blanking on the species, where the pruina on the apothecia make them look blue, which is again a relatively rare color in lichens. As I mentioned before, whether the thallus is cracked or smooth is a really important feature to look out for. And then there's this whole other level. So again, depending on how involved you want to get in the world of lichenology, everything I've mentioned so far, you can just use your eyes or maybe a hand lens. A few features require a microscope, but for the most part, that's all you need. There's a whole other level. Again, this applies a lot to crusts, but it does apply to some of the Foliose and Fruticose lichens as well, chemical spot test reactions. Predominantly, we use C, which is bleach, K, which is potassium hydroxide, and I, which is iodine. So if you're keying a lichen out, you'll probably see some like, K plus red or C minus or things like that. And those are those chemical spot test reactions. So basically, you would put a teeny tiny amount of one of those chemicals on a lichen. It may or may not change color depending on what compounds it has in it, and that is a useful feature for identification. On a similar note, so again, I'm jumping into another aspect of lichen biology here, but lichens are, one of the really cool things about them is they are just full of secondary metabolites. And a lot of these have really cool uses in medicine. Lichens have been used in dyes, and some of them are antimicrobial, some of them actually may have some potential in anti-cancer treatments. And so there's a lot of really cool stuff there, but of course they are also really useful in identifying lichens through these spot test reactions. Or again, if you're deep in the world of lichenology, you'll use thin layer chromatography to get a whole chemical profile on a lichen and use that to identify it. So again, different levels depending on how deep you want to get into it. Some of these secondary metabolites fluoresce in UV. So another really useful trait that comes up in some keys is putting the lichen under a black light or a UV lamp, if you actually have access to one of those, and seeing whether it fluoresces a certain color or not. Again, it's not universal, and that's the whole idea. Only some of these have it. But it's also a really fun activity. Depending on where you live, you can go outside at night and shine a black light on the surfaces of trees or rocks and see if any of those lichens fluoresce. Again, I can make no guarantees for whatever particular region you're joining us from. I'm from South Florida. If you go out into the Everglades at night, which please be careful if you do, because there's a whole lot of creatures out there that will try to eat you. But if you do it safely at night and shine a black light on a tree, you get a whole psychedelic experience of crazy colors fluorescing in UV, and it's all different crustose lichens. So a really fun activity to just try if you can. Okay, so we actually have a little activity now. It's a silent activity, and I will basically give you the answers right afterwards, but just to sort of see what you remember from everything I just threw at you in terms of lichen terms and traits. Take a look at this lichen and just in your head, or if it helps for you to write it down on a notebook or something, identify as many features as you can, including what growth form is this. And I'll just give you, 30 seconds. It's not a long activity, and then I'll give you the answers. So yeah. And I included this one because there's quite a few. There's going to be 2 more after this that we'll look at as well. All right. Now, I'm a lichenologist, so I have trained my eyes to see a lot of these things. So let's see how many of them you picked up. First of all, this is a foliose lichen. That may have been a bit tricky because it's really 3-dimensional. And actually in this picture, you can't see the lower cortex. None of these lobes have been flipped over. So it's just from experience that I identify this as a foliose rather than a fruticose. This has apothecia. So these really fun looking brown discs are those sexual fruiting bodies. Fungal spores are going to come out of here, be dispersed on the wind, most likely, and land somewhere else and try to form a new lichen. The individual parts of this lichen thallus, because it's foliose, they are lobes. This might have been harder to see. You might have had to get really up close to the computer and even then squint a little bit, but there are cilia here. They're pale or white, and they're coming off the edges. And then there are also, so like I said, some lichens employ both strategies of reproduction. So there are also soralia. These powdery edges here are the soralia. So like I said, this had a lot of different features going on. All right, let's try another one. So again, take a look at this, think about what growth form it might be, and identify as many features as you can. And I'll just give you about 30 seconds for that. Okay. I was counting seconds in my head and I realized I had gone way past 30. Okay, so this is one of those ones where we might call it squamulose if we have, multiple options of growth forms, or we might put it into that broader category of fruticose because it's got this three-dimensional quality to it. I only mentioned this briefly, so, give yourself personal bonus points if you remembered the term powdecia. So that's these sort of raised stalks that these apothecia are on top of. These really cool bright red apothecia. So the common name of this is, of course, is British soldier's lichen. These are and it's a cladonia species. And these are the squamules. So these are the different features that I wanted you to find here. All right, we're going to do one more. There's only a couple features to look for in this one. So I'll just give you a few moments on this one. So again, what growth form are we looking at? What other features can you identify? All right. So again, this is just a photograph of a lichen, and lichens are notoriously difficult to identify from photographs, but this is a crustose lichen. It's totally flat against the substrate that it's growing on, which happens to be tree bark. And again, bonus challenge, these are sexual reproductive structures, but they are perithecia because they are this sort of raised above convex shape on the surface. And this is a pyrennula species. It's very common in the tropics, but there are some temperate pyrennulas as well. But hugely diverse in the tropics, I should say.